a regional approach. And the outcome would be that countries are left in a position where they can identify, assess, and strengthen and report OECMs based on a solid OECM roadmap or framework. And so we've been rolling out this model over a number of countries, and it's really heartening to see that OECMs are really taking root in Africa, and we're seeing more and more interest from a number of countries in our region who want to start these OECM dialogues and start identifying OECMs. The reality is that no country in Eastern and Southern Africa, except for Eswatini, one of the smallest countries, has actually reported OECMs. And so there's this need in the next 5 years to really up our game and start identifying and reporting OECMs. But as I said, essentially important is that we respect the process. And so we've been implementing this over a number of years with some of our core partners that are members at a regional, global, or national level, and through various instruments like MOUs with governments, with the SADC Secretariat, and so forth. And so last year, we formalized the strategy under our new Target 3 framework called Space for People and Conservation Effectiveness. It has 4 core stages to it. I'll speak to the one, but the others really talk about assessing and improving the effectiveness of protected and conserved areas, and then developing our own regional knowledge and capacity and lesson sharing, which will underpin the implementation of this. But I'd like to focus on the first one, which is amplify. And this is essentially our OECM stage. It talks about integrating inclusive conservation areas into naturescapes. And this is a very simplified breakdown of the national dialogue process that we follow, but it has 4 main stepping stones. The first is the dialogue itself. And I think it's important to emphasize this isn't a process that's undertaken in one workshop. It normally takes 3 or 4 workshops over a year to a year and a half. And it's an iterative process. So you keep building on information that was generated before. A key component is the policy review. It underpins the discussion and is a good starting point. And the idea is to review the alignment between national legislation and policy frameworks as it relates to OECMs, identify gaps and opportunities to recognize them. Then the case study, sort of taking the theory to empirical evidence, assessing potential OECMs in the landscapes. This often happens with members on the ground that are working with local communities or other sectors and going and assessing these sites and bringing the results back to your next stakeholder workshop. And ultimately, the outcome is a national OECM framework or roadmap, call it what you will, which essentially outlines how the country is going to assess, recognize, strengthen, and report these OECMs in a way that is equitable and representative towards Target 3, and hopefully embedded in policy to ensure that it can really be enacted. But the idea is that it's a multi-sectoral, multi-ministerial roadmap for OECMs. These are just the kind of the 6 core components we've identified of an OECM national framework. There may be more for other countries, but ideally you want to have a framework that is going to address all of these core components for identifying, validating, reporting OECMs and really driving that OECM agenda. So folks, I don't want to take from the other presenters' presentations. That was a bit of a whirlwind introduction to OECMs, and this is recorded, and there will be more opportunities to engage more in OECMs. We are hoping there'll be an OECM session at the African Pavilion at the World Conservation Congress, where we will be showcasing a lot more examples of OECMs from the regions, and we hope that you can join us there. But without further ado, sorry, this has changed now. I'm going to invite Thomas Berner from the IUCN Coastal and Ocean Resilience Program to share a presentation on marine OECMs. And as I said, this is really a topic that is taken root in the region and is becoming quite topical. So Thomas, you can share your presentation now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here. All right, so I'm just gonna, you let me know. I hope you can see my presentation.
Yeah, it's not in presentation mode. There we go. Thanks.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
Nice. Okay, great. Wonderful. Okay, well, thanks so much, Dan, again, for the opportunity to sort of present a bit our work and our line of thinking on how can we actually also accelerate the establishment and recognition of coastal and marine OECM in the next 5 years. Just before I start, I think it's also important just to sort of very briefly provide a bit of context when it comes to the ocean conservation world and where do we stand at within the 30 by 30 targets in ocean conservation. As it is right now, the world, so at the global level, we currently sort of formally protect and conserve 8.4% of the ocean. And in all transparency, we've made close to no progress whatsoever between 2020 or 2021, which was the first report of the Aichi targets, which at that time was reported to be 8%, to 8.4% today, 5 years later. There is a couple of reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is that the ocean is extremely big. As I'm sure you guys know, it's 70% of the planet. And so therefore, protecting 30% of the ocean is obviously, a huge task in terms of, volume of effort, of funding, of area to be conserved, and ultimately, of course, of the number of people that have to be involved in active stewardship of the ocean. That's one thing. The other thing is, recently, we've actually sort of made a brief kind of scoping assessment of currently sort of how many MPAs, so marine protected areas, are in the pipe at the global level. And we found that there is between 40 and 50 MPAs currently in the pipe. And if they all get gazetted by 2030, so in the next 5 years, and of course, that also means that at the same time, none of the existing MPAs do not get de-gazetted, that's another issue. But if all those 40 or 50 currently sort of existing MPA in the pipe would get gazetted, that would add at most 5% to the 8%, to the existing 8%. So all of all, that would sort of basically bring us to 13%.
Sorry,
So
Thomas, the slides
yeah.
moving. Not moving
No,
outside.
not yet. I just want to. Yeah, no,
Okay.
it's not yet. So the reason why I'm bringing that up is because basically this OECM tool is of critical importance for the ocean realm for us to be able to achieve the 30 by 30. It's basically probably going to have to contribute maybe at up to half of the 30%, so 15%. And yet, as it is right now, virtually almost no marine OECM has been reported globally, very little. I know that Canada has reported a few, Philippines has reported a few, a couple here also in the region, but it's very, very limited. So for us, it's very important to put this into the perspective because basically it's critical that OECM and the way that we would actually sort of apply this OECM tool is actually useful to achieve the 30 by 30, and therefore it needs to be applied at a large scale. And in the ocean realm, again, to be actually effective in terms of conservation and achieving conservation outcome, scale does matter a lot. Mostly because while the ocean is probably the most interconnected sort of biome in our world, and with all those ecosystems, because obviously, as you can imagine, this is extremely fluid, and scale does matter when we want to achieve conservation outcomes, positive conservation outcomes. So this is very much one of the key sort of perspective that we departed from when we've started developing the regenerative seascape approach. And so now I'm just going to sort of briefly present what we understand by what is a regenerative seascape and how do we think and hope that we can actually have those ultimately potentially recognized as OECM. So for us, a regenerative seascape is a place-based integrated approach to ocean and coastal management, right? And the aim is very much to restore, sustain, and ultimately enhance the social and economic vitality of those areas. So it's not just indeed about conservation. It is maybe even more so, maybe even more primarily about sort of supporting local stakeholders to become the stewards of those areas and to sustainably use and benefit from those areas. So it's what ultimately what we call about, it very much is about sort of regenerative blue economic development. but in a way that, obviously sort of contribute actively to the conservation agenda, as well as, climate change agenda, and ultimately sort of the development agenda. It's also a question of sort of recognizing that when you look at the Aichi targets, unfortunately, when we arrived at 2020, none of them were actually sort of achieved. The world has failed the Aichi targets. And there is chances indeed that we would fail again if we don't sort of deliberately sort of find ways that we engage and we mobilize and we empower and we give the means and the tools and everything in between to the local stakeholders to ultimately do what they are best placed at doing. Care of our so this is very important. Ultimately, sort of the vision of those seascapes needs to be, they need to be driven and inclusive. They need to be ecologically vibrant, right? So it's all about sort of restoring the natural capital that is, a pre-requirement for the resilience, the socio-ecological of, the ecosystems as well as the communities. And ultimately sort of the broader society around. They need to be economically thriving, because ultimately this is the more sort of you develop a nature-based economy on a healthy and thriving natural capital, the more sort of ultimately sort of resources you will generate to actually support positive outcome for nature, for the climate, and for the people. They need obviously to be socially just. Those cannot be established against the people. This is a very, very clear, I believe, lessons from the past decades. There is a reason why, overall, we've actually sort of failed in many areas. So here we are extremely deliberate that this needs to be led, driven, and very much sort of, sort of owned by the local stakeholders, first and foremost, of course, indigenous people and local communities. Of course, it's also about sort of celebrating the cultural values and, the importance of those areas for those local communities. It's about climate resilience, because ultimately, those areas needs to really contribute actively to the climate agenda, both in terms of adaptation, mitigation, and overall socio-ecological resilience. And of course, they need to be locally grounded on what we would call, in our case, for instance, on sort of smaller, locally driven area-based conservation measures, or even also sort of, marine protected areas. And the smaller locally driven area-based conservation measure, often in our world, we refer to them as LMMEs. But ultimately, again, as I've said before, scale matters. So even though one seascape might not be able to, achieve the scale to achieve the 30 by 30 by itself, it's very important that this is embedded into a broader regional network that ultimately will sort of, comes together and really sort of, reinforce each other, including in terms, not only in terms of socio-ecological sort of connections and connectivity, but also in terms of socio-economic linkages and coherence. Those are the 9 essentials elements that we are deliberately trying to address when we establish a regenerative seascape. So one, of course, is to create the enabling legal framework, social political support. This is absolutely critical, and in particular at a subnational level, but not only, but we're very deliberate to engage, with the governors or sort of the president of the regions, so that ultimately they can lead the charge on this agenda. We're also sort of very deliberate in, driving ecosystem-based management approaches. We're also very, very deliberate on the fact that we need to mobilize the private sector and become so that they can contribute directly and actively and positively. And here I mean it's really about sort of moving from sustainability to regeneration. I often say that the 20th century should have been the century of sustainability. Well, clearly it hasn't, otherwise we wouldn't be where we are today. Now it needs to be about regeneration, and the economic engine needs to become a driver of regeneration. So that's very, very, very important for us. Of course, we need to establish adequate institution and capacity, both in terms of governance and sort of the capacity of the management of those institutions. Sustainable financing mechanism, which needs to be blended. We obviously, from a conservation perspective, really be deliberate and proactive in addressing the threatened species and supporting their recovery. All about maintenance and restoration of critical ecosystem, as I've mentioned before, as well as the human well-being, generally speaking. Now, the few steps that we take when we actually sort of establish those seascapes is the first one is about sort of really scoping and defining the boundaries of that seascapes. We try to, as much as possible, to really use a jurisdictional approach. So very much use existing jurisdictional boundaries and apply those on the seascape. So ultimately, for instance, at the provincial level in Mozambique or at the county level, you know, in Kenya, etc., so that then we can actually use this already legally recognized, you know, jurisdiction as a way to drive the establishment of the seascape. And of course, here again, leveraging and building and ultimately unleashing the leadership of the subnational governments, which is absolutely critical. But we also sort of put in place an inclusive governance architecture. At times, I even say that it very much is about participatory democracy. What we do is to establish those multi-stakeholders forum so that together, that really sort of, it brings together all the different and important key stakeholders from the seascape. And also in parallel, we also establish what we call the Seascape Council or Steering Committee, which is chaired usually by the local governments and then brings, you know, in an inclusive manner, all the different key stakeholders representatives so that that becomes basically the managing body and decision-making body for the establishment and ultimately the management of the seascape. The third step, which is absolutely critical, is to develop this regenerative seascape vision that needs to be co-developed by all the different key stakeholders, ultimately set targets, smart targets as we call them, both in terms of ecological and socioeconomic outcomes, and ultimately, of course, and very importantly, design a seascape roadmap that will, you know, help or actually be instrumental in achieving the targets and ultimately the vision that has been co-developed. And that needs to be, and that's very, very important, it needs to be translated into an investment plan that will also identify the kind of funding that is required for the kind of activities that, you know, needs to contribute to working that roadmap, right? So some activities, some investment can be sort of supported by private sector, by the local financial institutions, by investors, other more by kind of ODA kind of funding or philanthropic grants, others more through blue bonds and or public funding, and others potentially, you know, through nature credit or carbon credits, etc., etc. So this is very important to have this kind of blended approach to unlock as many sources of funding and ultimately as much funding as possible to as many as possible different stakeholders that will be accountable to deliver on specific roadblocks or kind of activities on the roadmap. The implementation and the adaptive management is obviously sort of extremely key. So that for us really is something that is critical, but also to make sure that not only do we sort of support the implementation of activities that ultimately provide direct, you know, sort of conservation outcomes, such as, you know, habitat restoration, etc., but also entrepreneurship programs and blue jobs creation programs, so that again, one comes with the others, and ultimately those, you know, new micro and SMEs and the private sector directly contribute positively, so those economic activities to conservation outcomes. And ultimately, of course, the monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which is very important. But I won't sort of enter into the details here. Just in terms of the
minute left, sorry. Sorry, I said you got a minute left. Sorry to rush you.
Yeah, I'm actually sort of finishing now. So I'm just sort of here, sort of trying to illustrate what does that mean based on what I've just presented to try to actually sort of corresponds to the CBD OECM criteria. So the first one, as you know, Daniel has just presented, is about making sure that we are geographically defined in terms of the area. So here, as I've mentioned, for us, it's about sort of making sure that we have clear boundaries delimited and that those are ultimately sort of approved and really sort of become the boundaries of the seascapes. The governance and the management mechanism through the Seascape Council in particular, which is established officially either by sort of national or subnational decree, And of course, that becomes the main body in terms of the governance and the implementation of the roadmap and the management of the seascape. The long-term biodiversity outcome is all about sort of making sure that the seascape roadmap is not only co-developed and approved, but ultimately is implemented by the local stakeholders first and foremost. And of course, here I also put the evidence to compile for us to sort of see how can we actually, provide evidence that will feed into the OECM sort of assessment and ultimately into sort of the recognition of those seascapes into OECM. The effective in situ conservation, of course, it's all about making sure that the measures, the rules, the regulations that are established in the management plan and the roadmap overall of the seascapes are conducive to contribute directly to in situ conservation. And in particular, that also means that it should restrict any harmful activities, including large-scale sort of industrial activities, which are usually sort of very detrimental to conservation outcomes. And last but not least, of course, it's all about sort of the sustained management. And here it really is about sort of establishing those sort of blended financing mechanism at the seascape level to support local stakeholders. Of course, those are the few steps that I'm sure you know already, which is the first one, which is the self-assessment and the gap analysis. Ultimately, that gap analysis will inform you on what needs to happen to potentially recognize an area as an OECM, or for it to be eligible to be recognized as an OECM. Then you do the full assessment. It's reviewed. Ultimately, it should be, of course, endorsed by, and in fact, in our case, we would aim for the national governments to submit the application of the seascapes to the World Database on OECM, which actually triggers automatically sort of the validation of that national governments, and of course have that after that, of course, published at the World Database on OECMs. A few, and this is my last slide, a few of sort of the key institutional and legal enabling condition is, of course, to make sure that the legal recognition of seascape boundaries and governance exists. So that's why for us, we use the jurisdictional approach. Of course, it's absolutely critical to secure the tenure and customary rights. That's also why we work on establishing what we call the foundation of those seascapes through LMMAs in particular, and establishing network of LMMAs within those larger regenerative seascapes. Obviously, the environmental and social safeguards, that needs to be driven, led, and in fact, as much as possible, sort of demand-driven by the local stakeholders. And that's, for us, it's very, very important. We will not go somewhere where we haven't been invited to go. We only go where we've actually been requested to support, and that's, our modus operandi. And last but not least, of course, all of these needs to be integrated at a broader sort of scale level within the policy and the marine spatial planning frameworks when and where it's possible and when and where they exist. I'll stop here, and I hope I didn't go too far on my time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Thomas, for that informative presentation, and I think very, very relevant as we see these dialogues around marine OECMs taking off in Mozambique, around Madagascar, potentially Tanzania, and I'm sure now in Angola. So it was very informative. Thank you. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask people who may have questions to just put them in the chat, and if you don't mind answering them there, Thomas, so that we can move on to the next presentation, else I'm worried we run out of time. But folks, if you have questions specific for Thomas, please put them in the chat, and Thomas will monitor them. He's with us for another 15 minutes. He can answer them there. I'm going to invite Malidadi now to present to us on behalf of ICA, specifically on the recognition of IPLCs as OECMs. So Malidadi, if you could share your screen.
Thank you, Daniel.
Great. So while you do that, I think just to say that ICA has become a core partner of IUCN in the region. We've recently signed an MOU with ICA, and so we really look forward to taking this conversation regarding OECMs forward in partnership with ICA and its various regional representatives. So thank you very much for joining us, Malidadi, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Maybe people might want to see my face, but I'm afraid my internet is not very good. So bear with me. yeah, like Daniel said, I am going to talk about OECM recognition from the perspectives of indigenous peoples and the local communities in Africa. Let me also talk a little bit about the definitions. The first one, OECMs, I don't need to talk about that. I think Daniel has defined it quite well. But maybe I can talk about indigenous peoples. AICA is an acronym standing for Alliance for Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities for Conservation in Africa. So in terms of definitions, indigenous peoples, it's more to do with self-identification linked to ancestral territories and the histories, and also distinct cultural and governance systems. So there are some people, in short, in Africa, some communities who self-identify as indigenous peoples. Local communities, a bit contentious, but people tend to classify them as the people or communities who have been settled in some place and have some customary ties to those landscapes. So in AICA, we try to juggle these two definitions because the indigenous peoples have got some legal implications at UN level. Local communities don't. And then in order for us to move forward as a collective community in Africa, during the African Protected Areas Congress in Kigali, we resolved that other than worry about differentiating or defining who is IP, who is LC, why don't we look at our common issues that we face relating to conservation? So AICA embraces both indigenous peoples and local communities on the premise that we share the same conservation-related challenges, and we are better off working together so that we can deliver on our priorities as far as making conservation or as far as centering people in conservation is concerned. So why is it important to recognize the role of IPLCs in OECMs? I think the first one is that I think it is recognized that indigenous peoples and local communities have conserved some landscapes for a long, long time, based on their traditional knowledge, traditional governance systems, and also other aspects unique to IPLCs. So, for instance, a World Bank study notes that up to 80% of biodiversity is found in IPLC territories. And also key biodiversity areas often overlap with landscapes that are managed by IPLCs. So that is quite an imperative. We cannot do or practice OECM without the involvement of IPLCs. Then we have issues around the equity and the rights-based conservation. If you look at the GBF, if you look at the UNFCCC, and all the conservation conventions, they always talk about ensuring that we have rights-based conservation that puts people at the center, or conservation that works for people. So that too is an imperative that has to be observed in implementing the OECM concept. And also, it enhances conservation effectiveness by recognizing the role of IPLCs. It can also help to better integrate traditional knowledge and governance systems that have helped in maintaining these landscapes to what they are today. And then also meeting target 3 is largely contingent on the recognition of these IPLC territories or OECMs, because most countries may not have new land to declare as national parks, and also they are likely to face resistance. So by recognizing these existing IPLC managed landscapes, it smoothens the way to meeting target 3. And then also there are treaty imperatives like the UNIDRIP, CBD, and all others. Like I said, they also demand that IPLCs have a role and their interests have to be respected. Now, what are the policy responses that need to be considered if we are going to implement OECMs effectively? I think the first one is the domestication of the OECM concept by ensuring that it is integrated into national policy and legal frameworks. Without such integration, we may not be successful to implement the OECM concept properly. It may continue to be looked at as an IUCM program or a project, or that NGO's project or program. But if we put it in the legal, integrating the policy and legal frameworks at the national level, we have a better chance of implementing the concept. And then as we develop these national policy and legal frameworks, we also need to look at the criteria and the guidance. My colleagues have talked about assessing sites, potential sites. So that presupposes that there has to be a good assessment criteria and the guidelines for implementation. And all of these, again, arrived at through consultative processes at national level. I am glad to note that such processes are already underway in some countries, as we have heard here. And also the legal recognition of IPLC territories. Many of the community conserved areas are not legally recognized. And the communities don't have rights over such territory, such land and resources. So by moving towards recognition of legal recognition of such territories, it will help to smoothen the way for implementation of OECMs and also reduce resistance, given the history of displacement and dispossession relating to the establishment of protected areas in the past. And then we also need to look at the co-management. The policy and legal frameworks need to provide for shared governance some of the landscapes. It's an opportunity for communities and the state protected areas to work together to deliver conservation benefits. And then the policies also have to look at capacity building to strengthen governance, technical capacity in all manner, including ensuring that the funds are flowing to these sites at the lowest level or at community level. I talked about identifying the sites, ecological assessment of the sites as being crucial to this process. Now, what are the benefits that recognizing IPLCs in the OECM implementation brings. One is the enhanced landscape connectivity. If you look at the SADC region, we have the TFCA concept, and if we can successfully implement the OECM concept, it is obvious that it will improve the connectivity of our protected areas or conserved landscapes by bringing community conserved areas close to the state protected areas in some management framework within the context of OECMs. And then there is also some benefit in terms of cost effectiveness. I think we all know that managing protected areas, national parks, game reserves, is quite an expensive affair. And that's why many governments are struggling to manage these spaces. But it has been proven that community conservation is much, much cheaper and cost effective. So the OECM concept can leverage this benefit in pursuit of conservation outcomes. Another benefit now for people is the enhanced protection of community rights or IPLC rights. Because if their community conserved areas or their OECMs are legally recognized, it will also come with some rights protection, or it will enhance the protection of those rights that people have been crying for. And then also capacity building, I mentioned this, but it's a strong benefit because legal recognition will also entail that for these areas to be managed properly, there will be need for capacity building in all manner, technical as well as the governance. And then the funding opportunities, we think that if these spaces or these landscapes that are currently managed by communities are legally recognized, it will also act as it will serve to attract resources to go to such areas. Currently, most of the funding is going to state-owned protected areas. But we believe that such recognition might bring resources to the lowest level, at the community level. And then we also have to look at the fair and equitable benefit sharing. So again, by recognizing IPLC managed lands, that would increase opportunities for increasing benefits to communities. Some of them include funding. So in conclusion, I would say that the recognition of IPLC and their territories as OECMs is important to improve rights, also governance, and also equity and the conservation outcomes. So in ICA, we look at the operationalization of the OECM concept as an opportunity, one for legal recognition of these community conserved areas, but also as an opportunity to secure rights, community rights over these lands. And it is also an opportunity to ensure that target 3 is not reached or achieved by another round of displacement and the dispossession of indigenous peoples and local communities. So these are some of the perspectives that I can share in the space that has been provided to me. Thank you so much.
David, thank you so much for your time and your great presentation, which gives a very clear perspective from the point of view of IPLCs and ICA. So thank you for that time. Again, colleagues, if you have any questions for the presenters, please do pop them in the chat and we'll try and get to them. Without any further ado, then, I'm going to invite Gladys Waringai from the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association to now present us a sort of a sector-specific example of potential OECMs in the Kenyan context. So Gladys, if you could share. All right, I see you've got it up. There we go. Great. Over to you. Thank you very much, Gladys.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good morning. My name is Gladys Wariga from the Kenya Wildlife Conservers Association, which is the national body for wildlife conservancies in Kenya. And so I'll just be taking you through the conservancy model and how it's visible in being recognized as OECMs and the steps we're taking, but also sort of the challenges we're experiencing. And a couple of them, I think, we can relate to some previous speakers, so it will not be very new. And so just to start us off, in Kenya, we have sort of our current status in terms of protected areas and conserved areas is just listed in this slide. And so we have a blend of the protected areas in form of national parks reserved, which are managed by the government, and which represent about 8% of our conservation area in Kenya. That's wildlife conservation area. And then we have wildlife conservancies, and wildlife conservancies, which is number 8, is basically these are areas that are managed, owned, governed, and managed by either communities or private landowners. And then we have forest reserves, which basically overseen by government, but there's management with the community areas. And we have other instruments that are developing in the recent times just to try to enhance our conservation impacts, and the likes of leases. We have concession agreements, we have easements. We also have some areas where they recognize themselves as ranches, and basically these are wildlife areas with other mixed uses, but they don't call themselves as conservancies. And then we have an interesting emerging model that is developing what we call co-managed areas. And the co-managed areas are largely government land areas, which are being co-managed by communities and private entities. And this could also include what we can call even marine species. And as the presentation that has just been presented, we have quite a number of marine species that are government governed but co-managed between government and private entities or communities. And so our focus will be on the wildlife conservancies, which is number 8 for the rest of the meeting, for the rest of the session. And just to highlight where we are in terms of recognition of wildlife conservancies within the Kenya legal framework, it's quite robust, and the developments are stemmed from our Constitution of Kenya 2010, which recognizes the right to healthy environment and which obligates the states to encourage public participation when it comes to environment conservation and management. And then we have a significant development in 2017, where our national land use policy recognizes wildlife conservation as a proper land use among other land uses. And also the government is encourages development of wildlife conservancies and sanctuaries as a measure to address land use conflict. And then in 2020, we have our wildlife policy, and which basically recognizes a whole segment on conservation on community and private lands. And then going to also our Community Land Act, we have 3 land tenure systems in Kenya. We have public land that is governed and managed by the government. We have private land, and then we have community land, which is accounts for about 80% of our land mass as a country, and so it's quite significant. And the Community Land Act provides framework for recognition of community lands, their registration, their protection. And so it's quite an advancement. And I had the previous speaker talking about the importance of recognizing and really confirming rights of ownership within such spaces. And so we have this, and it's a development in terms of also securing tenure and decision-making structures within the community setups. And further, we have in 2013 a significant development where the conservancies were recognized. And as we speak about the term recognized, I think it's important to think, what does this term mean? And different jurisdictions have different attributes of what recognition is and what it entails, because we are seeing different interpretations across different jurisdictions. And so our Wildlife Act of 2013 recognized conservancies by defining it. And this definition is quite important as we move on, even in terms of how we recognize or potential for conservancies to be recognized as OECMs. And we term a conservancy as land set aside by individual, owner, body, corporate, group of owners, or community for purposes of conservation. And it goes ahead and says who can establish, and then also provides a requirement that wildlife conservancies, just like national parks and marine protected areas and sanctuaries, shall be managed through a management plan that requires gazetting. And I had, through the conversations that came up, the element of gazetting. And again, the government maintains a record of what conservancies we have in management plans. And the conservancies, just like parks, as they develop their management plans, these are gazetted sort of legal documents, and they require annual compliance. And so those are some of the things we'll be looking into. What does this mean when it comes to the elements we've just discussed earlier on OECMs? And so we have diverse model of conservancies, and we categorize it based on types. That is the first kind of categorization. And this is also informed on where they occur, on the land setup they occur. We have private conservancies on private land. We have group conservancies, which are basically an amalgamation of private land parcels coming together, owned by individuals, private individuals, or private families or private groups, and they come together to do common management. So that's a group conservancy. And then you have community conservancies, which are conservancies set up on community land. And also important to notice that group conservancies, some of them were previously community in nature, but subdivided, and now the individuals are coming together for purposes, management, collective management purposes. Then you have a sanctuary, which is specific for conservation of one or more species. And then we have, interestingly, and this is a conversation that will be evolving within our country for the next phase, ranches and farms. And basically, these are sort of user rights, but there's an element of conservation. And also, these are important elements too, as we think about an OECMs. We also have another category of conservancy, and this is based on the level of growth of the conservancy, whether a conservancy, it could be either at a level of where you're operational, fully functional, structures of governance and management are present. We have those that are emerging, those that are dormant, and there are those who are proposed, and those that are potential. And so the last two are basically the potential and the proposed are sort of ideas for having in mind. They've recognized there's biodiversity significant in an area and needs to be managed maybe in the form of conservancy. So we have those categories. And in terms of distribution, the distribution is such that the private conservancies account for 32%, the group conservancies account for 26%, the community account for 39%, and the co-managed areas account for 3%. But majority of the group are largely collectively managed by the communities themselves. And so in terms of management, it's still the community that does that in a collective manner. And so we have all those conservancies. They are quite diverse in terms of model, in terms of also why the objective for which they were established. And so some of them are basically to integrate, to allow pastoralism to take place, coexist with the wildlife, and good grass for wildlife, for pastoralists is also good grass for wildlife. So there's that integration. There are those who do conservation to manage or reduce degenerative practices. There are those who do to promote coexistence among communities and promote good grass that enables coexistence among the communities. There are those who do conservancies for purely conservation purposes, maybe protecting some species. And so we have diverse model across. But in general, what we have as a conservancy is that we do not have conservancies that are purely just developed for purposes of just wildlife. Conservancies, unlike the national parks and reserves, have a correlation in terms of there is multiple land uses that complement each other. I'm trying to move to the next slide. I don't know why it's misbehaving.
Yeah. Gladys, just a note also, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay. This is a highlight of where we are at in terms of conservancies. We have 215 conservancies to date, including KWC membership, and they contribute 9.6 million hectares, so quite significant in terms of contributing to the larger conservation outcomes for the country. And in total, when you combine the conservancies, the 18% and what we have with the national government, then we have significant areas under conservation. And this just a pictorial of how our wildlife biomass has decreased over the years. And the second map is just showing that conservancies have been created in areas whereby there's still hope for, there's still significant biomass and biodiversity, and there's basically structures to create hope that there can be reverse while people are doing other activities. And so, as said, it's much more than wildlife. We have social elements and social outcomes. We have environmental outcomes. We have economic outcomes. And so all these things blend into what we do as a conservancy. So this is just a highlight of the impact so far in terms of conservation. I will not move into that, but also going to the larger question of, and I think that this goes back to the first question, what difference between a protected area and OECMs. And our legal framework currently, the Wildlife Act 2013 provides a protected area. And let me just move to the next slide. A protected area being a geographical space recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve long-term conservation. And so this is quite general and can be interpreted to include conservancies. It doesn't go into the classification of protected areas like we have in this slide. And so conservancies could be interpreted to fall under category 5 or 6 based on that broad definition and without going to the larger classification. And so that has been a big issue when it comes to seeing how we recognize conservancies because of that general categorization. And this just highlights some of the other challenges that we are experiencing in terms of our definition of a conservancy depicts such that it's like a formal dedication or designation of land just purely for conservation, but we see it's more than wildlife conservation, there's integration. There's also that mandatory requirement for gazetted management plans for conservancies. And so that purely puts in management objectives being conservation. And then we have draft conservancy regulations of 2016 that we might be revisiting in the near future, in the next year, that requires the registration of conservancies, bringing in the element of the long-term. If you remember, it's about long-term conservation outcomes. And so that brings a bit of an issue, especially if there's non-compliance with the management plan. And again, our policies they are disintegrated, they are disjointed in natural resources. And so creating a proper framework on which OECMs can sit has become quite a bit of a challenge. The forest, the wildlife, water, all that has become an issue. And we're trying to see, can we create a space that is integrated? Lastly, some of the steps that we are taking as a country to address this. We have an ongoing review of the Wildlife Act, and which is attempting to recognize OECMs, trying to create, to review the conservancy definitions, that it doesn't demonstrate or depict or misinterpreted to mean it's purely a protected area other than the other two categories, or just purely a protected area. And also just clarifying what we mean are protected areas. And we are moving towards a direction that protected areas will only be those that are government governed and managed. That's the national parks and reserves. Again, our targets are for 30 by 30. The conservancies have been recognized as potential areas to help Kenya achieve our targets. And then the diverse model of the conservancy, where it's not just about wildlife, it's integrating the social, economic, and the ecological impacts, basically presents that opportunity. And also we are moving towards developing an integrated natural resource framework. that can help us get into sort of a coordinated space. But other than that, we've done the dialogues, we've done a policy review. We're in the process of now trying to assess the water potential of the conservancies, of potential of some sites, including conservancies. And that, I think, will help us inform, the practice will help inform our policy. And this is a big challenge that will be happening within the country, just trying to understand what works and what doesn't work, and what are the principles that should be adopted. So that's pretty much it. And over. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gladys. That was a very informative presentation, and it's really useful to get this sort of sector-specific perspective. I think if anything, recognizing OECMs is not a simple or straightforward process, but given that, I think if we want to do it right, we really need to understand these contexts, such as what Mali Dadi painted for us with regards to respecting and recognizing IPLCs, but then in your context, the complexities around some of these existing sectors and how we draw them in and recognize them as OECMs. So thank you very much for that presentation. I'm now going to hand over to our last presentation. And folks, again, I just really encourage you to put your questions in the chat. Gladys, I see there are 2 questions there for you from Holly and Nunes. If you don't mind having a go at those. I'm going to now invite Vladimir Russo from Fundusau Lasima and Wild Bird Trust to really give us an example of a national dialogue that's been going on in Angola, as well as a site that was assessed, a community site assessed against the OECM criteria. So Vladimir, I think I'm going to present for you. You just need to tell me when to change my slides. So hopefully you can see that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, everyone. I'm sorry, I'm in a remote area, so I've asked Daniel to show the slides for me. I'll just quickly show the camera so you can see I'm not a bot, I really exist. I hope you can see me here. Yes, I'm Vladimir Russo from representing Lizima Foundation here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this national dialogue process that we are following in Angola. And before going there, just going through the reasons why we are doing this national dialogue. Okay, so you can just move to the next slide. So Angola is party to the National Biodiversity Convention and to the CBD, and because of that, we have certain requirements which include the development of our national strategy. So we've developed the second national strategy for 2019-2025. It's ending this year, and we are in the process of developing a new strategy for the next 5 years. And as part of the strategy is to increase the number of protected territory in Angola. So currently, our territory covers 13% of the terrestrial territory, and we do not have any marine protected areas. Okay, so because of this process, and because the process of establishing protected areas in Angola is quite a lengthy process, it needs to go to Council of Ministers and to go through National Assembly. We decided we've been approached by Minister of Environment, and with IUCN agreed to work towards developing this national dialogue. So National Lizima, Wild Bird Trust, and the Nature Conservancy teamed up to provide support for Minister of Environment for this national dialogue. Okay, next one. Okay, so I just want to show you, so you can have an idea of when I say our territory is covered by 13% of the with protected areas. This is how more or less those protected areas are established, and you can see it's a huge country, and the protected areas do not cover all the provinces. So what you see there inside of those blocks are provinces. We do not have parts in each and every province, and there are certain ecosystems, certain biomes, certain areas that are not protected. Okay, and then it's important to come up with a new ways of protecting our resources. Next one, please. Okay, so this is just an example of 3 protected areas that have been proposed, and those areas have been proposed in 2021, but still 4 years down the line, they have not yet been designated. When I say proposed, it's, field work was done, identification of the areas, the zoning of the areas, the management plans were developed, the boundaries were developed, the type of protected areas were developed, so there was a technical proposal to approve these 3 terrestrial areas, and you can see in terms of size they are quite small. In particular, the Morocco and Kubira one, those are escarpment forests, quite small, but 4 years down the line, they've not yet been designated. Next one. Okay, so we also started a process back in 2015 for the establishment of ecological or biological significant marine areas. And as part of this process, those areas that are here have been established. So the process started in 2015, and the establishment of EBS that was only formalized in 2023. Okay, 22-23. Now there is a process to look at those 7 EBSs that you can see there and try to transition from EBSs to NPAs. Next one, please. So one of those EBSs, the marine, the Namib EBSA, has already been proposed as an NPA, okay, or part of the EBSA, not the entire EBSA. So a similar process, looking at what EBSas were proposed at the time, a research process, stakeholder consultation process with the different stakeholders, with the different authorities and fishing organizations, provincial organizations. So there was a long process to propose an NPA, and this marine NPA, which is actually an NPA that is a transboundary NPA because it shares with Skeleton Coast and the Namibia side. So that has been proposed, and also this has been proposed since 2021, but has not yet been designated. Okay, next one. Okay, so what I wanted to give you with this information is that we've been having proposals. Some were just ideas, but others, like the 4 terrestrial and the 1 marine proposal that I just said, those proposals have been submitted to government and they are yet to be designated. And 4 years have passed. So we've been looking at what alternatives are there for the establishment of other types of protected areas. So we've been investigating, for example, community forest reserves, which we are not including in this presentation, but community forest reserves are other potential protected areas. We are looking at, for example, biosphere reserves, so we can increase the size of protected areas in Angola and try to find different entry points because the normal current protected area process is quite lengthy. So we started this national dialogue process, starting with a number of stakeholder workshops. We call the first and the second national dialogue workshops. We had one in December last year and another one in May this year, so to discuss and present a number of topics to socialize the OECM concept, to discuss with the different partners and identify potential OECM alternatives or OECM sites. Next one. So as part of this national dialogue, which has been going on for almost a year now, it will be for 1 year in August, we've been having lots of discussions with stakeholders, private stakeholders, civil society, government, including, of course, the Minister of Environment, to try to come up with a process that will enable us to streamline the establishment of some sort of protected areas, in this case, in the form of OECMs. We have also done a literature review and a legislation review to understand how we can use OECMs to increase our protected areas. So a legislative process, a legislative review of our legislation to identify key entry points has also been developed and presented in May this year. We are currently now reviewing the last document to issue the final report, which provides us some guidance on how can we use the current legislation to establish OECMs, because we do not have OECM legislation in the country. Next one. So as part of the process, the national dialogue process, as you can see the picture there, the first workshop we've provisionally identified 5 potential OECM sites. Okay, so the idea is once those sites are selected or pre-selected, then we will go through the site assessment, the OECM site assessment tool, to validate our information and confirm that those sites are adequately or could adequately become OECMs and undertake a full site assessment. Okay, so site assessment has been done for sites that are currently under development or research by Fundação Lizima in Chico province, and that was done this year, and also another site that is managed by the Nature Conservancy in the Guangdong province was also undertook a site assessment tool. Next one. So these site assessments really to identify the potential for these sites to become OECMs. Although, as I say, we are still going through the legislation review process to understand how we can designate OECMs in Angola. It's important that we continue using the IUCN process for site assessment, for OECM site assessment, and the definition of a number of documents and procedures so we can actually see if the sites meet the criteria. So this is the landscape where we've been working and under which we've undertaken site assessment. It covers, it's a quite huge area, 151,000 square kilometers, covers 5 provinces, different levels of government. No official protected area exists, okay, which is one of the first questions of the site assessment tool. We have a few protected areas north and south of this area, but no protected areas have been studied. So this is the site, for those sites we've been investigating a little bit more. And as I say, site assessment process is ongoing. We will keep on obtaining information to come up with a better boundaries and a management structure of those sites. Next one, please. Okay, so those we are calling these sites, domains, land domains. Those are areas that are communal land, and they are managed by the SOBAs. The SOBAs are the local chiefs. They are responsible for managing the land and managing the relationships between human beings and the land, the types of uses, how they can be protected, etc. So we are working on those 5 domains. Of course, when you look at the domains, not all the domains will necessarily form the boundaries of the OECM, but will be parts of those domains could become OECM. So that's an ongoing process that we are still undertaking. Some of the sites, some of the domains are already a bit more advanced in terms of information than others, but that's an ongoing process. And 3 important aspects we need to consider here. One, of course, is the land use and the relationship with the local authorities, the traditional authorities. The second one is really understanding the baseline information, environmental and social baseline, what is there to protect, how is it relevant to protect. And the third one is what legislation is there that will allow us to move into OECMs. Okay, next one. So in terms of key recommendations based on what we've learned with this process, we're still learning. It's a very early stage process for us. As I say, we've been in this less than a year, but it has been very motivating to get all the different stakeholders involved, as I say, private, civil society, and government. But in terms of this specific site assessment, we are currently producing a report which will have a bit more detail, but in terms of what we have right now is that there is trust gaps between the communities and the national and local government. This is pretty much due to the war context in the past, where there was really lack of trust, and in these areas were areas that were so far from the government structure. There was no government structure there for many years, so there is a lack of trust on that specific aspect. And this might affect OECMs are for online for the recognition of traditional land governance. Okay, so although it is said that the local chiefs they have some sort of governance of the land, this is not written. This is not in legislation, which of course creates a bit of complexity there. You need to explain, first of all, explain what OECMs are and then how OECMs are going to be managed in this contract. Okay, traditional systems are also undocumented. So when entering these areas and trying to identify potential sites, one of the four important aspects is how is this going to be documented and how is it going to become enforced? Okay, in a way that you don't only bring the traditional, legal system from the government, but also the cultural and traditional systems that are used locally and they've been there for decades, even in that sense of government. Okay, and then of course the remoteness of the area, it's an important aspect for us to consider because the designation of OECMs and the fact that we are wanting to protect that land and bringing our own understanding of how protection should be done, how management should be done, can pose a risk to the population there, can pose a risk to the people there because it's bringing a concept that is unknown to the population, is unknown to us, but doing that in a way that becomes very clear that the objectives of the management of the area and the objectives are a way of sustaining the livelihoods of the people, respecting, of course, the traditional, the culture, and the environmental aspect. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you. So it's, as I say, it's a national dialogue. It's a process that's less than a year now, but it's becoming mature and mature. And lots of people getting involved, and meetings like these and opportunities to share our experience and learning from others will enable us to have a better process in the future. And in future, we should be able to start formalizing the OECMs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vladi, for that great presentation. And yeah, I mean, I think it's been very insightful, the process that we've been running in Angola. I think both from the national dialogue point of view, again, it's never straightforward. Our national contexts are often quite complex, and we need to embed this OECM concept within national contexts. So yeah, it is a process that really requires a lot of patience and deliberate engagement. But I think the site assessment you've just unpacked, I mean, it's obviously a lot more complex. And I was privileged to be a part of it. I think what it indicated is that every site really is different, and we need to respect the context for each site. No two are the same. It really answers one of the questions that we can't just recognize entire landscapes as an OECM because they fall, for instance, within a key biodiversity area. We need to go out and assess each and every site because they are different. And these site assessments are adding a lot of value to these dialogues. And I look forward to going to assess the conservancies in Kenya with Gladys. So thank you to all the presenters for sharing their experiences and perspectives. It's very useful. Of course, we can never get into the depth that we would like to in an hour and a half webinar, but I believe that this recording will be shared. The slides can be made available, and you can reach out to the presenters or to IUCN if you would like more information. And I think there's certainly more need for these types of webinars. Folks, we are on the half hour, unfortunately, but I don't want to cut it off if there are questions and if presenters are willing to stay online to answer them. Curity or Sophie, if it's okay with you, I'm going to carry on and push through, and I understand if people need to drop off, but I'm going to take a few questions. Again, there are questions in the chat, like from Holly, how is the cost of the assessment of potential OECMs covered? I think it's a really good question at this stage. In the Angolan context, they were covered by the partners, Fundusao Lasima, Wild Bird Trust, TNC. In Kenya, we're finding project-specific funding from Biopalma to support the assessments. In Zambia, it'll be TNC and WWF covering them. So it really depends on who the partners are in these national dialogues and how we pool resources together. But the long-term cost question is an important one, and it's something that we need to unpack in these national dialogues. and to start costing the assessments, to cost what is needed at these sites to continue supporting effective governance and management. It's quite a big undertaking. All right, I'm going to then ask if you do have a question that you'd like to ask to a presenter. I'm assuming they can stay on. Please raise your hand and I'll give you the floor to ask your question. So I'm looking for any raised hands. I know it's late in the day and everyone needs to hop off probably. So I think then if there aren't any specific questions or raised hands, I'm just going to ask the presenters to look at the questions in the chat if you can answer them. And then I'm going to just once again thank the presenters for your time, thank all the members who joined this Fireplace and took part, and for your interest in OECMs. I think it's a really growing topic in the region, and I'm excited for the potential that it holds. But I think it's a really delicate space for a number of reasons. And we don't want to repeat past mistakes. We want to make sure it's done properly. OECMs can either go really badly south, or it can be a massive opportunity for us to regenerate area-based conservation in the region and do it right. But it needs to be led by the region and led from the front. So we look forward to sharing more of these examples at a national, regional, and site level with you. We encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions or need additional material. And if you are sitting in a national government or a national partner and you would like to take this conversation forward and initiate a national dialogue, please do reach out to us, and we can put you in touch with the right people or support you as best we can. So thank you, colleagues, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks once again to the presenters.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank
our
you. Thank you,
presenters.
Daniel.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Bye-bye. Good evening.